Imagine having to sift through 500,000 historical reports.
Right. Without a search bar.
Exactly. You're not sitting at a dual monitor setup. You are physically traveling on horseback, crossing blistering deserts from Iraq to Egypt, gathering 500,000 fragments of oral history.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
And from that massive, unwieldy mountain of data, you have to select just 4,800. But the real weight of this comes from what happens next.
What they actually do with them.
Right. Those 4,800 fragments you choose aren't just going into some dusty university archive. They are going to fundamentally shape the laws, the ethics, the court systems, and the daily lives of billions of people for over 1,000 years.
That is a massive legacy.
It really is. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are looking at a fascinating, peer-reviewed academic research paper that explores the life, the legacy, and the incredibly intense methodology of Imam Abu Dawud al-Sijistani.
A giant in the field.
Yeah. He lives from 817 to 889 CE, and he is the compiler of the Sunan Abu Dawud, which stands as one of Sunni Islam's 6 canonical hadith books.
A foundational text.
Absolutely. And our mission for you listening today is to really unpack how this 9th century text was actually built, how it functions as a highly complex legal toolbox, and what happens when it violently collides with modern controversies, empirical science, and human rights.
Before we jump into the mechanics of that toolbox, though, we need to set some clear parameters for the listener.
Good point.
The source material we're unpacking today is dense, and it contains highly charged religious, political, and social debates.
Yeah, we cover a lot of ground.
We really do. We are going to be touching on incredibly diverse viewpoints, ranging from traditional Sunni and Twelver Shia scholarship to the critiques of modern feminists, rationalists, and ex-Muslims.
So we want to be absolutely clear up front.
Exactly. We are strictly neutral. We are not endorsing any theological, political, or social viewpoints today. Our only goal is to impartially report on the ideas, the specific critiques, and the scholarly defenses exactly as they are laid out in the original source material.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand Abu Dawud, you have to understand the sheer chaos and the brilliance of the world he was operating in.
Yeah.
We are talking about the height of the Abbasid Golden Age.
To understand that, you have to look at the massive intellectual ferment happening across the Islamic Empire at the time. Abu Dawud was born in Sijistan.
Which sits around modern-day eastern Iran and Afghanistan.
Right around 817 CE. The Abbasid Caliphate was experiencing this unparalleled intellectual development, but it was also deeply fractured.
Very fractured.
Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, was being aggressively formalized into distinct schools of law, and simultaneously scholars were terrified.
Terrified of losing the history.
Exactly. The generation of the Prophet Muhammad's companions and the generations immediately following them were long gone. Scholars realized they needed to systematically preserve the oral traditions, the hadiths, before they were permanently lost to time or deliberately distorted by political factions.
And Abu Dawud's approach to preserving those traditions wasn't passive. The source material highlights this grueling practice called Rila fi Talab al-Ilm, which translates to journeying in pursuit of knowledge.
He took that very literally.
He literally traveled across the entire known Islamic world, the Hijaz, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Khorasan. He was physically hunting down oral traditions from the most authoritative transmitters alive.
It makes modern academic peer review look like a walk in the park.
It really does. And that 1% acceptance rate I mentioned earlier, out of roughly 500,000 hadiths he tracked down, he only chose about 4,800 for the Sunan.
Yeah.
That is an editorial slashing so extreme it almost defies belief.
It speaks to a very specific, highly pragmatic methodology, because many people assume all compilers had the exact same goal, but they didn't. His contemporary, Imam al-Bukhari, was trying to compile a book of absolute, unquestionable historical authenticity, the Sahih.
But Abu Dawud had a totally different objective.
He had a completely different objective. We actually have his own words on this, because he wrote a highly transparent letter called the Risala to the people of Mecca,
laying out his exact editorial framework.
Yes. His goal was to build a practical, functional legal manual for jurists. He wasn't just compiling a history book, he was providing the raw materials for a working justice system.
Which brings up a fascinating paradox that the paper highlights. If you are building a foundational legal code, why would you intentionally include hadiths that are graded as weak or da'if?
It seems counterintuitive.
Right. From the outside, that sounds like building a skyscraper with deliberately flawed steel. Wouldn't you only want the most ironclad, authentic reports?
Well, what's fascinating here is how early Islamic legal theory weighed evidence, particularly within the Hanbali school of thought, which heavily influenced Abu Dawud. In their framework, a mildly weak prophetic tradition, meaning a report with a slight flaw in its chain of transmission, was still considered infinitely superior to pure human opinion.
What he called Ray.
Exactly. Pure human reasoning, or Ray. If a jurist faced a novel legal issue, and there was no perfectly authentic hadith to guide them, Abu Dawud would provide the least weak prophetic report available.
Ah, I see.
The idea was to anchor the law to the Prophet's era as much as possible, rather than leaving a 9th century judge to just guess based on personal logic.
And he wasn't trying to trick anyone.
No, not at all. He explicitly flagged hadiths that were severely weak. Furthermore, he established a rule for his readers.
If he remained entirely silent on a hadith?
Yes, meaning he didn't leave a critical margin note next to it. That meant the hadith was saleh, meaning it was structurally sound enough to be used in a legal argument.
So he essentially created a 9th century open source legal code, crowdsourced from camel-riding scholars across continents, and left margin notes for future lawyers to know which precedents held weight.
That's a great way to put it.
But this entire system rests on one massive pillar: trusting the chain of transmission, the isnad.
Yeah.
And that brings us to what the paper describes as a massive epistemological battleground. For a long time, Western academics, specifically names like Ignaz Goldziher and Joseph Schacht, raised a very loud critique.
A very influential critique in the West.
Right. They looked at the timeline and pointed out that the Prophet died in 632 CE, yet Abu Dawud is compiling this text over 200 years later.
Yeah.
They argued that many of these hadiths were actually just 9th century legal debates that scholars cleverly retrojected backwards in time.
They essentially looked at a hadith and said, this sounds suspiciously like a 9th century Baghdad property dispute, not a 7th century prophecy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does the tradition defend against that?
The Goldziher-Schacht thesis dominated Western academia for decades, but the modern academic pushback is incredibly robust.
Who's leading that?
Researchers like M.M. Azami and Harold Motzky, they have systematically dismantled the idea that hadith transmission was just a giant, unreliable game of oral telephones spanning 2 centuries.
How do they prove that?
They demonstrated through extensive textual analysis that written records existed far earlier than previously assumed. We are talking about sahifas.
Which were early personal notebooks kept by the Prophet's companions.
Exactly, and musanafs, which were localized, early written collections. The 9th century compilers weren't inventing these chains from thin air. They were heavily relying on these earlier documented textual layers.
That significantly narrows the fabrication window.
Very much so.
And the traditional scholars themselves were hyper-aware of the threat of fabrication. The science of isnad criticism wasn't just taking someone's word for it. It was essentially a massive, rigorous background check.
Oh, it was intense.
They evaluated every single narrator in the chain based on 2 strict criteria: adala, which is moral uprightness or integrity, and dat, which is precision of memory. Think of it like checking the references of a journalist today. Does this person have a history of lying about mundane things? Do they actually take good notes?
Right.
If a narrator was known to have a failing memory in their old age, their later hadiths were flagged or rejected entirely.
The verification system was obsessive in its detail. Biographical dictionaries were created just to track who met whom, when they lived, and how reliable their memory was.
Wow.
But the evaluation of those narrators is also where some of the deepest historical and sectarian fractures in the Islamic world occur.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material dives into the Twelver Shia perspective.
Yeah.
Shia scholars look at these exact same Sunni chains of transmission and deconstruct them using a totally different framework.
A completely different lens.
They point out that Abu Dawud's Sunan relies on certain narrators who are historically aligned with the Umayyad dynasty, and by extension, politically opposed to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Their critique is fundamentally structural. How can you trust a theological text that was passed down through individuals who were sympathetic to an empire actively fighting the Prophet's own family?
The Sunni rebuttal to that critique centers entirely on their definitions of adala and dat.
Okay, so integrity and memory.
Exactly. Sunni hadith critics, like the master evaluator Yahya ibn Ma'in, established a rule that a narrator's political or sectarian affiliation, even if they were aligned with the Umayyads or harbored anti-Ali sentiments, did not automatically disqualify their hadiths.
Interesting.
The logic was strict. If an individual was proven to be personally pious and they possessed a flawless, verifiable memory for transmission, their reports were accepted.
So the mechanics mattered more than the politics.
It's somewhat akin to an editor vetting a controversial reporter. Even if the reporter holds political views the editor vehemently disagrees with, if that reporter takes meticulous notes, can corroborate their sources, and has never been caught in a lie, you publish their quote.
Makes sense.
Sunni critics argue they definitely identified and discarded blatant political fabrications, but they wouldn't throw out a mechanically reliable transmitter purely for their political leanings.
It exposes a massive fault line in early Islamic history. It's a fundamental debate over who actually holds the authority to pass down divine law.
Yes.
Is it the broad general community of structurally reliable companions, regardless of their political faults? Or is it exclusively the imams from the prophet's direct bloodline?
It's completely understandable how that single epistemological split determines entirely which texts a community considers authoritative today.
And that question of authority becomes even more pressing when we move from historical debates into contemporary application.
Definite.
Which is the perfect pivot into what the research paper categorizes as the taboo questions.
Right, the really tough stuff.
Because we've talked about how the book was built. But the real tension happens when a 9th century legal framework crashes headfirst into 21st century realities. Let's look at how modern scholars handle hadiths that seem to clash violently with contemporary human rights, social ethics, or empirical science.
Okay.
Starting with gender and social ethics. The sources spend considerable time on Hadith 5271, which touches on female circumcision.
This is a highly sensitive issue, and the mechanics of how scholars deal with it are very revealing.
Walk us through it.
The specific hadith in Abu Dawud states that circumcision is an honor for women, but the legal application depends entirely on authentication.
So the chain of transmission again.
Exactly. Abu Dawud himself reportedly flagged this hadith as having a weak chain in his own era.
Wow.
Moving into the modern era, preeminent hadith experts like Sheikh al-Albani also evaluated the chain and graded it strictly as da'if, or weak.
So if a hadith is definitively weak, and modern heavyweights agree it's weak, that essentially pulls the rug out from under any modern legal ruling trying to use it to justify the practice, right?
It does. A weak hadith cannot be used to establish a binding legal foundation, especially when it contradicts a massive overarching principle.
Like what?
Modern Islamic institutions, including Al-Azhar in Egypt, alongside various global medical ethics councils, have explicitly forbidden the practice of female genital cutting. They don't just rely on the fact that this one hadith is weak.
They base their prohibition on something bigger.
Yes, on the foundational Islamic legal principle of la darar wa la dirar, which means do no harm.
Do no harm.
It is a massive legal canopy. An isolated, structurally weak report cannot possibly override the absolute fundamental prohibition against bodily mutilation and causing harm to a human being.
It's a clear hierarchy of legal principles, and the paper points to another highly scrutinized hadith in the Sunan regarding domestic discipline. It's a report stating that a man will not be asked why he hit his wife.
Classical scholars actually noted the weakness in the transmission chain of that report centuries ago.
Oh, they did? Yeah. But modern scholars take the analysis a step further. Thinkers like Khaled Abu el-Fadl argue that you cannot read a weak, isolated report in a vacuum.
You have to look at the whole text.
Exactly. You have to place it against the explicit Quranic mandates that command believers to live with women in kindness and equity. Furthermore, you have to weigh it against the overwhelming volume of authentic hadiths detailing the Prophet's own peaceful example in his household.
And his explicit verbal condemnations of domestic violence.
Exactly. The broader prophetic tradition establishes an inviolable standard of human dignity that automatically recontextualizes or entirely overrides these isolated problematic reports.
So if weak hadiths are being sidelined for domestic and bodily harm issues based on overarching principles, how does that framework handle the really severe stuff?
You mean the penal code? Yeah, I'm talking about the criminal punishments in the Sunan, the hudud laws, things like amputations, stoning, and also the regulation of slavery. How does a modern jurist navigate texts describing practices that are largely illegal under international human rights frameworks? Let's take hudud first.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, We have to recognize the vast chasm between theoretical classical jurisprudence and modern application.
How so?
In classical Islamic law, jurists imposed evidentiary conditions that were so stringent they were nearly impossible to meet. For example, to actually execute the punishment for adultery, the law required 4 reliable eyewitnesses to testify to seeing the explicit physical act of penetration.
Wow, so you'd essentially need a public orchestrated exhibition to ever get convicted in a classical court.
Precisely the point. The mathematical impossibility of proving the crime meant that these severe punishments functioned primarily as profound moral deterrents rather than frequent everyday practices.
I see.
The law contained its own self-limiting mechanisms to preserve life and reputation. In the modern era, major scholars and institutions, like the Fiqh Council of North America, argue that many of these penal hadiths were context-specific to historical statecraft and the maintenance of public order in late antiquity.
That makes a lot of sense.
Today, they argue that international human rights frameworks actually align beautifully with the broader ethical objectives, or maqasid, of Islamic law, which prioritize the preservation of life, intellect, and dignity.
And how does that concept of maqasid, the higher objectives, apply to the hadiths regulating slavery? Because the Sunan has extensive chapters on it.
The critical distinction is that the Sunan did not invent slavery. It was regulating a ubiquitous global reality of the 9th century.
It was everywhere.
Right. It introduced protections and rights for enslaved people that were entirely unprecedented for the era. However, contemporary scholars universally point out that the legal vector, the direction the law was actively pointing, was always toward manumission or freeing slaves.
They wanted to phase it out.
Yes. Freeing an enslaved person was constantly prescribed as the highest form of expiation for sins. Therefore, modern jurists argue that the global abolition of slavery isn't a violation of Islamic law. It is the ultimate fulfillment of the law's original intended trajectory.
It is a phenomenal look at how a legal tradition breathes, adapts, and evolves over centuries without breaking its foundational links.
Yeah, it's very dynamic.
But the collisions aren't just in the realm of human rights. The paper also delves into empirical science.
The rationalist critique.
Right. Rationalist critics point to certain hadiths and argue that they blatantly contradict modern biology or cosmology. The classic, most debated example from the text is the hadith stating that if a fly falls into your drink, one of its wings carries a disease and the other wing carries the cure.
This is where we see a highly sophisticated epistemological framework emerge from within the Islamic tradition itself long before the modern era. The 14th century polymath Ibn Khaldun addressed this exact tension.
What did he say?
He established a crucial interpretive principle regarding what is called prophetic medicine. He argued that when the prophets spoke on everyday medical remedies or agricultural techniques, he was reflecting the cultural, empirical context and the common knowledge of 7th century Arabia.
He was a man of his time in that regard.
Yes, he was operating as a human being in a specific time and place. Those statements were never intended to be eternal, divine religious legislation binding on all future medical professionals.
So they delineate a hard boundary between the observable empirical world and the realm of theology.
That boundary is essential. Scholars draw a very distinct line between the physical world, which is governed by empirical science, biology, and human discovery, and the realm of Ghaib, the unseen.
And Ghaib means what, exactly?
Ghaib encompasses things like the nature of angels, the afterlife, or eschatological prophecies. Empirical science simply doesn't have the tools, the metrics, or the vocabulary to measure the unseen. So when a hadith touches on worldly matters like agriculture or biology and seems to conflict with modern science, many scholars are entirely comfortable contextualizing it historically. They don't feel that acknowledging a 7th century medical context threatens the theological core of the faith.
Speaking of other traditions, one of the details in the source material that genuinely surprised me was the inclusion of Isra'at.
Oh, yeah.
These are stories, parables, and traditions drawn directly from Judeo-Christian sources. Jewish and Christian lore actively woven into this massive Islamic legal text. Why would Abu Dawud include them?
It is a striking editorial choice, but it reveals a lot about the intellectual confidence of the era. Abu Dawud included these Judeo-Christian narratives very sparingly, and crucially, they were never used to establish core Islamic law or foundational theology.
What were they used for then?
They were utilized as moral analogies.
The paper actually highlights a very vivid cautionary tale from the text about an Israelite who was punished in the grave because he cut off a piece of his own skin simply because urine had fallen on it.
It's an intense image. But the purpose of including it is to serve as a stark warning to the Muslim community against religious extremism and taking ritual purity laws to a self-destructive, harmful extreme.
So he's using it as a moral lesson.
Yes, and the crucial methodological point is that Abu Dawud didn't just accept these Judeo-Christian stories blindly because they sounded pious. They were subjected to the exact same is-not evaluation, the rigorous chain of transmission checks, as any standard hadith.
Oh, wow.
If the transmission chain was sound and the content of the story didn't explicitly contradict Quranic theology, it was included for its ethical, reflective value.
It really paints a picture of early Islam being in deep, confident conversation with the older Abrahamic traditions surrounding it.
Absolutely.
But looking internally at the Muslim community itself, there's one particular hadith in the Sunan that has caused endless, massive debate. The 73 sects hadith.
The famous one.
Yes. It states that the Muslim community will eventually fracture and divide into 73 sects, and only one of those sects will be saved. So what does this all mean? Who gets to be the saved sect?
Historically speaking, the irony is that absolutely every single sect claimed the title of the saved one.
Naturally.
Sunni scholars argue it refers to those who strictly follow the methodology of the Prophet's companions. Shia scholars assert it is exclusively those who hold fast to the imams of the Prophet's household.
And the mystics.
Sufi mystics claim it refers to the people of genuine internal God consciousness, regardless of outward labels. But from an academic analytical perspective, the fact that this single short text can generate such wildly different, deeply authoritative interpretations across centuries proves something vital.
What's that?
It proves that the Sunan Abu Dawud is not a monolithic, closed black and white rulebook. It is a profoundly complex, multi-layered text that absolutely demands sophisticated, expert hermeneutics to navigate.
Which brings us to a perfect summary of our journey through the source material today. Abu Dawud's text isn't just a random list of ancient quotes.
Far from it.
It is a meticulously curated, painstakingly gathered 9th century legal toolbox. And for you listening, the major takeaway here is that engaging with ancient, foundational texts, whether it's the Sunan, a constitutional document, or any historical canon, requires moving far past strict surface-level literalism.
Yeah.
You have to understand the massive, centuries-long tradition of critical commentary, contextualization, and fierce, rigorous debate that surrounds the text to actually understand how it works in the real world.
This raises an important question for anyone studying history or law. How does a single book manage to sustain 15 centuries of continuous, relevant interpretation?
That's the real test.
It survives and adapts precisely because its compiler, Abu Dawud, was intellectually honest enough to include varying grades of evidence, even the mildly weak ones, allowing generations of future scholars the necessary room to adapt, critique, contextualize, and apply its principles as human society has radically evolved.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over for you listening. Something that connects Abu Dawud's monumental desert crossing task to our lives today. We currently live in an era of absolute digital permanence.
We really do.
Every passing thought you tweet, every text message you send, every out-of-context video you appear in is recorded, stored, and archived forever. Imagine a future historian, 1,000 years from now, tasked with reconstructing your core values, your ethics, and your daily life from 500,000 random scattered fragments of your digital footprint.
Good luck to them.
Right. What criteria would they possibly use to separate the authentic you from the weak, reactionary, or fabricated versions of you? And honestly, would any of our modern societies survive that level of grueling, 1,000-year scrutiny? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you for exploring this with us.